Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston webinar, COVID-19 Vaccine Employee Considerations. I'd like to introduce our presenters, Steve Bars, Jen Jackman, and Kevin McCormick. Before we get started, I'd also like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default, but if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenters today by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address a few at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded. The information contained in this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal advice. A copy of the audio recording and slide deck will also be emailed to you within 72 hours of the completion of this live presentation. And I would now like to pass the presentation over to Steve. Steve?
Well, good morning and welcome to everybody. We have over 100, almost 200 people enrolled, which I think reflects the strong interest of many employers in the current landscape about vaccination and employment. To start with, there's a lot of information out there that's available through the popular media, and hopefully today we'll be able to look at some of the information that is good, discuss some of the reports that are questionable. We think, and probably the people who have signed up for this appreciate, that almost every employer will likely be presented with some employee or some question as to the role of vaccination in their workplace, whether it should be mandatory, whether it should be voluntary, whether it shouldn't be addressed at all. Hopefully today we'll give you some information so that you can have in your company an internal dialogue as to whether vaccinations should be a part of your employment program. Let me tell you that this program was initially proposed because in December we had two notable events. On December 14th, on December 16th, the EEOC issued some guidelines about vaccination, and on December 18th, the FDA actually approved the first vaccine for COVID-19. This conversation today is not a medical dialogue. We certainly don't have medical degrees rolled up in our law degrees, but we will reference information from the FDA that's popular, that's out in the regular internet. And we'll focus primarily on federal law. As an overview, in order to understand where we are today, we'll talk about a little bit of the EEOC landscape before COVID even came out. Next, we'll talk about the EEOC technical guidance, and my partner Jennifer Jackman will address that in greater detail. Then I think the part of the presentation that everybody really signed up for, and that is recommendation for what we should do, what an employer should do, will be addressed by Kevin McCormick. Next slide. In looking at the landscape and how we got to where we are today, this is not the first time that the EEOC has looked at the pandemic and tried to reconcile that with what the requirements are, primarily for the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2009, in fact, the EEOC set out its first pandemic guidance. In that case, it was dealing with the flu. In March 2012, there was another pandemic that was certainly not as involved as COVID-19, and the EEOC again offered some guidance, primarily involving healthcare facilities and those situations where people came in close personal contact. Wrapping up to our favorite year, 2020, it was in February 4th that the FDA declared there to be a pandemic healthcare emergency. And that was relevant because that triggered the right of the FDA to accelerate some of the approvals for vaccines. It didn't automatically cause an approval, but it did set the landscape. The EEOC on March 17th issued a very comprehensive list of questions and answers dealing with COVID-19, and primarily because there was a background of the ADA which limited what employers could and could not ask in the general context, a non-pandemic. And there were a lot of questions about, well, what about, can I ask people about whether they have a fever? Can I ask people whether they have a family member with COVID-19? All of those issues were answered, presented in a first guidance by the EEOC. It's, you can go online. It's a full presentation. We're up to letter K in terms of the questions and answers. It's very helpful. Then we come to December 16th, 2020, and in fact, the reason for today's presentation. On that day, the EEOC issued its guidance, which explained its position with regard to vaccinations, what employer steps could take, what steps employers could not take. And surprisingly, 2 days later, the FDA actually issued its approval of the first vaccine. Let me take a section to talk about that approval. Just as background, because some of your employees may have the wrong thought or idea about what exactly it is. That approval occurred because, in the words of the CDC, that the vaccine may be effective. That was the words, may be effective. The data shows that the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks, supporting the company's request for the vaccine's use. For people 18 years of age and older, so even today, no vaccine is approved for anybody less than 18. It might be a curiosity to know that this decision that it may be effective was a result of 30,351 participants in a trial. Out of the 350, let's call it 30,000, 30,153. Out of 30,000, 15,000 were given placebos, 15,000 were given the actual vaccine. Out of those who got the placebo, only 185 contracted COVID-19. Out of those who got the vaccine, only 11. So 185 people got COVID as a result of not having the vaccine. 11 had the vaccine and contracted COVID. The result is that the FDA concluded that the vaccine is 94% effective, not 100%, 100, but 94% effective. The publication gives no indication about how long the vaccine would be effective or what its long-term effect would be. Next slide. The primary question for the EEOC is reconciling a requirement of vaccination with the ADA's general requirement that employers may not conduct medical exams or ask disability-related questions unless job-related and consistent with business necessity. What's disability-related? Well, it's likely to invoke some information that the employer should not have about a disability. Or what is a medical examination? You can't have a medical examination unless it's job-related. And even then, it cannot seek to obtain information about physical or mental impairments or health. So how do you create a question, or how do you get the information relative to vaccination without tripping on those requirements? The guidance, which Jennifer will discuss in greater detail, basically sets a roadmap for what questions you can ask and what questions you may not ask in terms of vaccination. Next. As I just indicated, in March 17th, excuse me, that should not be 2020. That should be March 17th, actually it was 2012. There was technical guidance which allowed employers to ask some prohibited questions in the event of influenza and medical situations. But today we face a little different question, and that is, can you ask if anybody in the family has a flu? Well, chances are, if it's an administrative job and it's unrelated under existing ADA law, probably not a job-related inquiry. What about now? Can you ask if anybody in the family has COVID? Under the earlier April 2020 guidance, the EEOC has said that can be asked. Now we have the questions about whether you can ask if somebody has been vaccinated or will be vaccinated, or whether people in the family have been vaccinated. And again, Jennifer will go over the specific guidance. Next question. Next slide. The EEOC technical guidance that I'm discussing, and it's available online, asks these 9 questions and answers. Is a vaccination actually a medical examination? Can it go forward? Can an employer ask questions? What questions can they ask in screening somebody? Have you had vaccination? Can you take vaccination? Can an employer ask for proof of vaccination? Can you ask somebody, can you require the use if there's currently emergency use authorization? What is an employer's obligation if somebody says, well, I can't be vaccinated, I have a disability? Can the employer seek more information on that? And what if the employee refuses a vaccination due to religious belief? Must that be respected? There's also some guidance about the, not too frequent issues dealing with genetic information. To what extent can questions be asked without running afoul of seeking genetic information? One final piece of background information, and that is that currently the use of vaccination is in a status called emergency use authorization. Emergency use authorization is a process by which the FDA allows the use of a particular pharmaceutical, equipment, medication prior to its full testing protocol, prior to it going all the way through all the tests that most pharmaceuticals would go through. And it's only allowed on an emergency basis situation. And as I said, in February, the FDA declared there to be a health emergency. The authorization bill requires that all recipients receive a fact sheet, and that fact sheet has to state that the employee has a choice, has an option to take the vaccine or not. That's a mandatory fact sheet that all vaccinated individuals or individuals who are presenting themselves for vaccination must be presented as a requirement for even receiving what's now the emergency use authorization vaccine. That situation kicks open a question which has yet to be clearly answered, and that is, while the EEOC guidelines that were issued in December talk about what an employer must do or how an employer must proceed in if it wants to have mandatory vaccination, there's a bit of a friction between that and the FDA requirement that says that individuals should be notified that they have the option to take it or they have an option not to take it. They're not required. So the friction that is unresolved at this point is whether, although the EEOC which is charged with policing employer rights, defining employment rights, is controlling over what appears to be an FDA requirement that says that since this is emergency use authorization, people have an option to have it or not have it. Well, if they have an option not to have it, how can you make it mandatory? And unfortunately, we have to stay tuned on that answer. That will, in effect, be a preview to some of the things Kevin McCormick will share a little later as to the decision as to whether we make this mandatory or not in anybody's workplace. Next. Well, as I look up here and we have, almost 200 attendees, it strikes me that many people probably tuned in or signed up for this webcast with the idea to get the answer. And unfortunately, you will find that there's no one answer for every employment setting. We think that the answer may be different if you are in a medical setting, a nursing home, a hospital, a medical facility, and already eligible to receive the vaccine, where it's necessary in the workplace. Are those rights the same as somebody who's in a administrative office? Many of our trade associations where there are remote workers or the ability to work with masks and other preventative steps taken. All of those hypotheticals will bear upon whether a particular policy is good for your company or not good for your company. With setting that background, let me turn you over to Jen Jackman, who will walk through the December 16th EEOC guidance and hopefully answer many of the questions that I posed. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And just kind of piggybacking on what Steve said, there are really two main issues here in terms of the different groups that are going to be addressing these issues. One are the groups that are frontline workers who already have the vaccine available, and so they're making that decision right now. The other one relates to the groups where it's not publicly available. We're talking about the emergency use vaccine, and when it will become available to the general public, can you make those mandatory? So throughout my my spiel on the EEOC guidance, I'm going to be really talking about two sets, ABC or XYZ hospital and ABC marketing firm. And just from their names, you can tell one is going to be involving frontline workers with patients, one is not. So we'll talk a bit about that. So next slide, please. So Steve previewed it. The EEOC guidance that came out on the vaccination itself was December 16th, 2020, 2 days before the emergency use was approved by the FDA on the first vaccine. And that's when the EEOC updated their guidance affirming an employer's right to require the COVID-19 vaccine. What does that mean exactly? If you require it, does that mean you can terminate? And if they refuse, and we're going to really dig in deep into those issues today. So let's talk first about what a medical examination is. If you remember the general rule that Steve shared in the very beginning of this presentation, employers cannot require medical examinations unless they are job related and consistent with a business necessity. So typically employers really try to avoid any kinds of medical examinations. In its guidance, the EEOC has come out and said a vaccine is not a medical examination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that answered the first question. The vaccine is not a medical examination, so you don't necessarily, and I say that, you don't necessarily have to show that it's job related and consistent with business necessity. But administration of the vaccine may actually require pre-vaccination questions that might constitute disability-related inquiries, which should be avoided absent that business necessity. So what are we talking about when we say administration? Actually giving the vaccine. So if you're giving the vaccine in your office, you have either you're a hospital setting and you can give it, or you bring in and contract with a third party that comes into the office, or you send your employees to that contracted third party. When they give that shot, they're administering the vaccine. And before they give that vaccine, as you know from other vaccines, they may ask you certain questions. Do you have allergic reactions in the past? Do you have specific medical conditions? Once they're asking that, that could be considered a disability-related inquiry. So what we've talked about with disability-related inquiries is there are difference, right? How can you avoid having those? Well, pre-vaccination screening questions, as I said, can be considered those disability-related inquiries. If an employer is requiring it and administers the vaccine, then those pre-screening questions would be a disability-related under the ADA. And in that situation, that's when you have to show business necessity, job-related. So in those situations where you are a CCRC or a hospital dealing with patients, you're going to see that obviously those are business related and potentially a business necessity, which if you compare to market, XYZ marketing group, where they're not interfacing with people, in that nursing environment and they have separate offices, it's going to be treated very differently. So you're going to have to figure out, do you want to be the one requiring and administering the vaccine? What would be non-disability related? If an employer offers the vaccine on a voluntary basis, as opposed to requiring it, this encourages but does not require the vaccine, then those questions can be asked without triggering those ADA concerns, since answering the questions is then voluntary. So if you make it available in your office, or if you tell your employees, yes, you can get it, if they have to answer those questions in order to get the vaccine, you're not triggering that ADA component because they can say no and not get the vaccine. Steve noted a bit about GINA, that's that Genetic Information Act. The EEOC has noted in its guidance that employer administered vaccination pre-screening questions may also violate GINA in terms of requiring that genetic information be given if some of those pre-screening vaccination questions also request that information. So again, if you're the one administering it and you're requiring it, it could be triggering different protections. Now, what happens if an employee refuses to give that information and it is mandatory? So if this is a situation where the employer has decided we're requiring the vaccine, the employee comes in to get the vaccine administered and then refuses to answer those questions as to whether they have pre-existing conditions and things like that. Well, the only remedy you have at that point is to refuse to administer the vaccine. You cannot retaliate against the employee for refusing to provide that information, because at that point it's considered disability related. So you need to be really cautious there. Again, and Kevin will get into this in much greater detail, if the employee then refuses to get a vaccine and you have a mandatory requirement to do so, you're going to have to go through the process of determining what your options are, and that's going to be really largely dependent on what kind of employer you are. Is it a necessity and job related? The EEOC also talks a bit about third-party administration. So that's when we were talking about if you're not the one giving the vaccine, but instead you've contracted with somebody else to do it. So let's assume that the vaccine is available to everyone. So let's assume we're 4 months from now or 3 months from now, hopefully, and it's no longer just for frontline workers, but the vaccine is available to everyone publicly. ABC marketing is requiring that the vaccine be given, but is not administering it. Employees have only instead to bring proof of the vaccine to return to work. So we're not doing it at the workplace, we're just requiring it, and they have to bring in proof. Is this a disability related inquiry? Well, under the EEOC guidance, no, it would not be a disability related inquiry, because provided that ABC marketing is not administering the vaccine and does not have a contract with a third party, this should not trigger ADA issues. So keep in mind, if ABC marketing did have a contract with that third party and was requiring it, then you would be triggering that. But if they don't have that contract and they're just letting the employee choose who it's using and just bringing in proof, there's no disability related inquiry under the EEOC guidance. Let's talk about another hypothetical. So Thomas is a nurse at XYZ hospital. XYZ hospitals employees have been approved for emergency use of the COVID vaccine. So it's right today. It's very relevant to where we are today. The hospital is requiring all employees to be vaccinated. So they're requiring it. Is this allowed under the EEOC guidance? And the answer to that question is yes. Pursuant to the revised guidance, the EEOC says asking or requiring an employee to get the vaccine is not a disability-related inquiry and is allowed. So in that situation, you absolutely can require it, and it doesn't trigger any of the ADA protections yet, and we'll get to what that yet means. What if Thomas's supervisor in this mandatory vaccine policy asks Thomas for proof that he's been vaccinated? We just went over this a little bit. Is that now allowed under the EEOC guidance where he's only asking for proof? And the answer to that is yes. Requesting proof of vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. So XYZ hospital can ask for proof. So at this point, they can mandate it and they can require proof. But what if Thomas says he has not been vaccinated and he's unwilling to do so? Isn't that the million-dollar question we're all here to address today? What happens next? Can the supervisor ask why? And the supervisor can ask why, but at that point, it may be triggering disability-related inquiries. For example, if Thomas says, I don't want to get it because I have a history of severe allergic reactions and I'm concerned, what this is going to trigger. Well, now he's given you information about it. He might even be triggering GINA at that point. That question can lead to disability-related inquiries. So if you're going to ask that question, you need to be really ready to know how to handle the next step. In that case, the employer must show that the inquiry is job-related and consistent with business necessity. So in the case of XYZ Hospital, where Thomas is a nurse and interacting with patients, they should be able to meet that burden. But if we were talking about ABC marketing, that might be a harder burden to meet. And like Steve said, unfortunately, there's no black and white answer. You're going to have to go on a case-by-case inquiry to see if you're going to be able to meet that burden. So obviously, if you're requiring it and someone says no, you're going to want to be asking why, because how effective is your policy if you're just letting people say no and you're not really enforcing it? Next slide. So that gets us to what a reasonable accommodation request is. So let's talk about ABC marketing. So now they have a policy requiring the vaccine to return to work. They're not a hospital, it's just a marketing agency. Rebecca refuses. Does ABC have to allow her to return to work? What do you think the answer is there? Well, that's where we talk about it's not black and white. It really depends. It depends what the reason Rebecca is giving for her refusal to return to work. Is she just scared of the vaccine? Is she anti-vaccination just because she's, heard of different issues? We know there's definitely a population who strongly is against vaccinations. Is it just because she doesn't want to return to work? Or is it because she has a disability or she has a sincerely held religious belief that prohibits her from getting that? So what the EEOC has said in its recent guidance is that employers may need to accommodate an employee with a disability or with sincerely held religious beliefs that prevent the employee from getting the vaccine. So now if you've dealt with these reasonable accommodation requests generally in your work or in your employment, you're going to know that's going to trigger certain duties by the employer to engage in the interactive process. So if now ABC Marketing asks that question, why, Rebecca? Why aren't you coming to work? If Rebecca says it's because of a medical condition or because of religion, it's going to trigger the next step. So if the employee refuses the mandatory vaccine because of a claimed disability, you then need to determine whether they pose a direct threat to the health and safety. If so, can that threat be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation? And if you go back to reasonable accommodations, what can those be? Well, depending on where they are, it might be working from home remotely, which a lot of employers have been allowing employees to do it lately. It might be reassignment to a different job if that's available. It might be social distancing if that can work, but it requires a case-by-case analysis to determine whether if they refuse the vaccine because of a disability, you can still accommodate them, and basically they would be still doing the essential functions of their job, and you could eliminate that direct threat. What does that require you to consider? The duration of the risk. How long is this risk going to be there? The nature and severity of potential harm. Again, that's really going to depend based on what your customer or client base is, or how your employment setting is set up with other employees. Can you socially distance? What's the likelihood of potential harm? And what's the imminence of potential harm? So what you want to keep in mind is an employer is not required to provide an ADA accommodation if it would create an undue hardship for the employer. So if, for example, the only way to allow this would be to hire another person to perform Rebecca's job, well, that's not going to be a reasonable accommodation. It's an undue hardship. But if it just means moving her to a different side or reassigning her to an available job, that would not be an undue hardship potentially. So what is a direct threat in this scenario? Well, a direct threat really would just be if an unvaccinated employee will expose others to the virus at their work site. Unfortunately, there's a lot of unknown questions here, right? Because we don't know for sure if being vaccinated means you can no longer transmit it. And so you may still have to have a lot of those PPE and everything available to you. So even with the vaccination, is that going to solve everything? Is the direct threat really, if they're not vaccinated, are they really likely to expose others to the virus at their work site? If there is a direct threat, is there a reasonable accommodation that can eliminate or reduce this risk? And that's those things we talked about: remote working, other PPE or protective wear, social distancing, and reassignment. So before you take any action or deny the accommodation, you really have to exhaust all of those considerations. And what they call that in the ADA is the interactive process. The direct threat analysis will likely evolve as we continue and as further information is learned about COVID, the vaccine and effectiveness of mitigation measures. So, what we talk about today, you're going to want to continue to follow up with. So let's talk a bit about religious accommodations. So under Title VII, the employer must provide reasonable accommodations to employees who refuse vaccinations due to a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, unless it would pose an undue hardship. And really some of those, that critical phrase there is sincerely held. So if an employee, just like with the disability accommodation, comes to you and says that their religion prohibits them from this type of medical intervention, then you need to look to see whether you can accommodate them. Now, interestingly, the undue hardship standard for religious accommodation is a lower bar than it is under the ADA for disabilities. And under the standard for religious accommodation means an undue hardship is more than a minimal burden on the operation of the business. So let's go through this hypo. So XYZ Hospital is requiring employees to be vaccinated. Arnold refuses and says he's a Christian Scientist and that Christian scientists do not believe in vaccinations. Arnold, who has children, recently had a bar mitzvah for his son. Arnold's supervisor has serious doubts about the sincerity of this religious held belief. Can the supervisor ask questions? And the answer is absolutely. If the employer has an objective basis for questioning either the religious nature or the sincerity of a particular belief, practice, or observance, it is justified in asking for additional supporting information. So in this situation, Arnold is claiming to be a Christian Scientist, but the supervisor knows that he recently had a bar mitzvah and is supported, and appears to be Jewish. Now, that's not the end of the inquiry. There's your objective basis. You can ask questions. It could be that while Arnold did have a bar mitzvah for his son, it's because his wife is Jewish and they're raising their child Jewish, but that Arnold truly is a Christian Scientist. So you can't just jump to conclusions and say, well, obviously this is a false claim. So you're going to need to do your due diligence. If you don't really have a basis though, if it's just subjective, so let's say they claim a religious exemption and you say, well, that can't possibly be. I've seen them at happy hour drinking and I don't think that they would be drinking if they followed that religion. Is that objective? I don't think that's objective enough to meet that criteria. But in any case, before you go to that next step of asking questions that trigger this protection, I would speak with counsel first to figure out whether you think you've met that objectivity. I'm going to now turn this over. Oh, actually, no, I'm not. I'm sorry. I have one more. So after Thomas from XYZ, actually, I have a couple more. Sorry about that. After Thomas from XYZ Hospital refused to be vaccinated, he requested a disability accommodation. Ultimately, the hospital determined he was a direct threat without the vaccine, and there is no accommodation available to eliminate the threat. Now what? So you've determined that he's a direct threat, and if he doesn't get this vaccine, he could carry it on to patients, which obviously is a business necessity to avoid. If there is no reasonable accommodation possible, the hospital can exclude Thomas from the work site. Does this mean he can be fired? And again, that's the million-dollar question here. You've now required the vaccine. You have a business reason for doing it. And he says because of his disability, he cannot take it. And there's no reasonable accommodation you can find. Can he be fired? And this is where it's a little bit gray. According to the EEOC's guidance, this does not mean that you can automatically terminate Thomas. Employers will need to determine if any other rights apply under the EEO laws or federal, state, and local authorities. So the EEOC was okay saying, yes, you can mandate it, but they have not gone as far to say, and if they refuse it, you can terminate. So it is a bit of a gray area. So at that point, you're going to be looking at, again, I think what they mean there is you need to go through the religious and disability exemptions, make sure there's not some other reason in the EEO laws that would prohibit you from going through the termination. Every time you think you're going to get to that step, I would just say you need to consider all options, including possible leaves of absences. The ADA has said that a leave of absence can be a reasonable accommodation. Really, I would strongly recommend that anytime you get to this point where you're thinking about terminating because you've mandated the vaccine and the employee is not taking it based on a religious or disability accommodation, religious or disability issue, you really should consult your counsel just to go through everything and make sure everything's lined up, because the EEOC did not make that final determination saying, yes, that's okay. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to go through the heart of this and really talk to you about what your best practices are.
Thanks, Jen. I hope everyone can hear me, and I'd like to welcome everyone and hope that you're enjoying this program. I think everyone has to agree that this is a very complicated, nuanced area that's evolving as we speak, and as more guidance comes out from the EEOC and the FDA and the CDC, it's incumbent on all of us to kind of keep our eyes peeled to make sure that we pick up on any other developments that come out. We're trying to make the best decisions based on the information that we have right now, recognizing that it could change. So one of the things I want to import on folks, because it's something that I felt concerned with when I first read all the press about the EEOC now mandating mandatory vaccination. And I think a lot of people are under the misapprehension that that's what it says. And hopefully you'll understand that that's not what the EEOC said, and that it's not a simple yes or no as to whether or not they can mandate it. It says you might be able to, and the might be able to is a great area that we're going to look at a little bit. Obviously, the first area that there's been a focus on is with healthcare providers. This is an area where they have the highest rate of risk of transmission of COVID. And by necessity, it requires aggressive approach to minimize the transmission. That's why in the hospital setting, if you're on the front lines like that, you will be getting vaccinated. And if you don't get vaccinated, you're going to have a really good reason, either for medical reasons or for religious reasons, and then other alternatives are going to be made. But the risk is so high in that circumstance that, as it stands right now, that's what needs to be done. And in many hospital settings like that, mandatory vaccinations are appropriate and are required. But that's only part of the workforce. There are lots of other folks like us who work in law firms and work in trade associations and work in other businesses, that the risk of transmission in the workplace is not nearly as high. And in fact, with the guidance from the CDC and the state, hopefully the risk in working in an office or something of that nature is minimized a bit, because many companies, what they do is they make people work from home. They make people only come in on a staggered schedule. They make sure that there's plenty of space between folks when they get here, so they socially distance. And that's one way to be able to reduce the risk without getting to the mandatory vaccination, because that's the area where it creates a lot of the troubles. Slide. The big question we have too, and this is something that's evolving, and hopefully with the passage of time and the administration of more vaccinations, people will come to the realization that getting the vaccine is not the worst thing in the world for you. In fact, it's probably a good thing for a lot of folks. Early on when we started looking at this issue, surveys were out there saying that 40 and 50% of the workers didn't want to take the vaccine because they were afraid they were going to get the COVID if they took the vaccine. Well, that's, medically speaking, that's not what happens. But you still have to deal with a situation where your employees, rightly or wrongly, might be concerned about getting a vaccination because they just don't like what they see. And this creates some big issues for an employer, so that if you're going to go down the road and you're going to mandate vaccination for everyone, you have to anticipate that there may be a few folks in there that are saying, no, I'm not doing it. Or there may be a lot of people who say, no, I'm not doing it. So let's take a look at each one. I mean, if you have one person who comes back and says, I'm not taking the vaccination, I don't believe in it, I don't think it's good. If it's just a commonplace fear that they might have, but it's not based on religion, it's not based on a medical disability related issue, you have options there as an employer. You could require them to work from home. You could say you can't come into work until you get the vaccination. You could ultimately terminate them perhaps if they didn't have a good reason for medical or religious reasons for not taking it. But that's one person. But what happens if you have a large workforce and you have 40 people that work in the office and 38 of them say, I'm not taking that vaccine. I don't, my cousin's sister's uncle took it and got sick from it, so I'm not going there. If you have a mandatory policy in place, you're going to have to think, am I going to have the policy in place and then, have 38 people just decide they're not going to take it? So that's one of the things that you're going to have to be focused on if you go down the road to have a mandatory vaccination policy. Next slide. This can come up in a couple ways, and you should be mindful of this because it's one of those concepts in employment law that always pops up around these times. If one person goes and complains and says, I don't want to take the vaccine because I think it's for whatever reason, I don't want to take it. You can deal with that on a one-on-one basis. You still have to go through the EEO analysis and everything else, but ultimately, if you clear all those hurdles and you get to the point where there's just no job for this person if they won't take the vaccination, you can actually separate them from employment. The problem is if you have a group of people come, or if you have one person come speaking on behalf of the group. So when you hear any opposition to taking a vaccine, you have to listen carefully to what the person is saying. If they're saying, I don't want to take it because I don't want to do whatever, that's one thing. But if they say to you, we don't want to take it because we are concerned about this, which could happen in a case like this, then your antennas have to go up and you have to be thinking to yourself, this sounds like protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. And I know when employees engage in that type of protected concerted activity, I can't fire them. I can't do certain things to them. I can't discipline them or discharge them for that. I mean, this is an old chestnut of employment law, and began usually in the stories I remember were, drivers working for a trucking company were concerned about the maintenance on the trucks, that the brakes didn't work, the tires were bald, and they were going to get in a serious accident. And they go to the boss and they say, we don't want to drive these trucks because they're unsafe, you need to fix them. And then if the boss comes back and says, well, we don't care what you think, so get out of here, that's a classic protected concerted activity issue. And you can't do it, okay? So you got to be mindful of that when you're dealing with employees and depending upon what their complaints are. Another thing that you have to be mindful of, not everybody's got a labor union in place, but many do. And if you want to consider having any type of vaccination program, like mandatory vaccination program, you're not going to be able to just go in and announce it and say, beginning Tuesday, we're starting this new program. If you have a labor agreement with a union, what you have to do and what you're obligated to do under the National Labor Relations Act is to negotiate with the union, because this is what's considered a mandatory subject of bargaining, which means that the company can't just unilaterally change it if they want. So that would mean that you would have to contact the union and say, union, we're interested in making changes. We want to institute this mandatory vaccination program for the health and safety of all of our employees and customers and other people that might interact with us. And here's what we propose. This is what we want to do. And you have to give it to the union, and then you have to listen to what the union says. The union has an obligation, or they can bargain over this, which means they can come back and they can say, yeah, we like your program, but we think you need to improve this, that, and the other thing. And so you have to go through that process. And ultimately, if the union denies the request, or you can't come to terms with the union over what the policy should be with regard to the mandatory vaccination, you can't implement it. And that's one of the concerns that you always have to be mindful of, that you want to get the union involved in it. Now, in many cases, when you're dealing with serious health conditions like this, the unions, they're concerned about their members too. And so they want to, it's not like they're going to come back willy-nilly, just deny it for the sake of denying it. They'll try and work it through, but it's an issue that you're going to have to think about, so that if you're trying to consider, do I institute a mandatory vaccination program in my workplace? If you have a union, you first got to think, well, would the union agree with me on this? And then you have to work it through that way. Next slide. Now, the other issue you have as a, again, non-healthcare worker, but, law firm, office work, you want to consider who are the people that are coming into your office to do things, the vendors, the visitors, business invitees. What a lot of companies do, we do it here, is we're restricting the number of people, outsiders who come into our workplace. And the reason we do that is because we want to, it's more difficult to control those folks. And we all know from our limited medical knowledge that the coronavirus doesn't distinguish between outside vendors, employees, business invitees. I mean, it looks to, contaminate whatever surface it can reach. So you might want to consider, as an employer, instituting, and this is good CDC guidance too, to limit the number of people coming in. You might want to make sure that when they do come in, that they're not here for a long time, that you stagger the time periods when they're coming in. And you also, most importantly, want to make sure that if you're going to work with somebody to come in and repair your computers or repair your copy machines or perform maintenance work in your facility, you want to at least have a conversation with that contractor about the contractor's compliance with CDC and state and local guidelines, because everybody wants to engage in safe work practices. In the early days of this COVID, some companies were actually making sure that they tested folks when they came in with the temperature to see, if they have a fever, they wouldn't even let them enter the building. And that's something that is possible. I don't see as much of it anymore, but maybe we should continue to do that. But the best practice is to make sure that you have people who you're dealing with take this pandemic as seriously as it ought to be. Now, one thing that we developed early on in the process was to, and this is something you might want to do with visitors or vendors, is to develop a form. I call it a COVID-19 waiver of liability, acknowledgement, and assumption of risk agreement. And it does a lot. And what it does is it reaffirms that the contractor is complying with all the CDC guidelines and the state and local requirements. It also lets the contractor know that there could be a possibility that they could contract COVID if they're on our work site. And we want to make sure that they're not going to come and try and sue us for it. And that's why we have in there the waiver of liability. So we want people to make sure that they're not going to do that. An assumption of risk, that's a big issue here in Maryland because that is a defense to a claim of negligence if you can show assumption of the risk. And so that's something that you can have prepared to have people sign it. And again, it, you know, from a legal point of view, it looks ominous, but it may provide the protection that you're going to need. Now, some people would say, well, why don't we do that with our employees when they're going to go for the vaccines? Well, the problem with that is, you know, if we have an employee and we want them to take a vaccine and we're telling them that it's safe and it's harmless, the optics don't look good if we give them a 3-page release where we describe the possibility that they may contract the disease by taking this, which is true, they could. But I think in most cases, employers don't want to do that. We, you know, on a limited scale, I saw early on in the COVID with schools. The schools were requiring students to sign these releases, and you know, it wasn't received well in the general population because, you know, on one hand you're saying everything is safe, come back to school. On the other hand, you're saying, but if you get sick, don't talk to me, I'm not responsible. So I don't think it would work well for employees, but certainly visitors and vendors, you know, that's something that you might want to know. And again, the point of it is you're not looking to avoid liability down the road because hopefully there isn't any. What you want to do is you want to impress on anybody you're dealing with that you take it very seriously and you're doing everything you can to comply with the CDC guidelines to make a safe workplace for your employees and customers or anyone else who might be on site without going through the vaccination routine. The other thing, obviously, if somebody doesn't want to play ball with us on that area, then you just don't let them in the building. And you move on. Slide. So I guess the final consideration that I would have for you, and I think I speak on behalf of Steve and Jen, that before you go down the route of mandatory vaccination, consider other options that might be available to you. If you decide ultimately that you need to get the vaccination, you know, one option you can do is encourage people to get the vaccination and not basically require it. Now you can encourage it different ways. You can just tell people it's a good thing to do. We want to roll in this together. You know, this is not something, it's not Republican, not Democrat, it's not whatever. It's, you know, we're in a pandemic. This is something that happens every 100 years, hopefully never again. And we all should do the right thing. But sometimes, you know, a little cash helps. And some companies have thought that maybe if they gave incentives, either in the form of cash payments or gift cards or some sort of an enhancement to get the employees to comply, that would be a good thing. And it might work. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you have a labor union, you can't do that because, you know, if you have a labor union, you're going to have to bargain with the union over whether or not you can give out the cash incentive. Although, in the practical world, I've seen it happen. Unions don't necessarily want to get in the way of employees getting more money, but that's a point. There are others who are very concerned about this notion of buying someone's cooperation by giving them money because, you know, the notion is they should be doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because they're going to get 25 bucks. So that's just a concern about the incentives to get people to go. But the important thing is it's a voluntary vaccination as compared to a mandatory one. The other thing is if you're going to give incentives to people, what do you do if somebody says, you know, I would get a vaccine, but I've got this disability issue, or I've got this religious issue, so I can't get it. Where's my money? So you're going to have issues like that that could come up. So, you know, the net effect of it is I'm not a big proponent of paying people to go get the vaccine. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make it easy for them to get it. One, you can make sure that the company pays for it or the insurance pays for it. Two, that it's easy for them to get there and get it done, that they don't have to stand in lines for 4 hours. You know, with strangers. So you can, all those things are very helpful and effective in getting people to get to the vaccination without having to worry about all these other hazards that would be reasons to avoid. The final thing is, again, we need to make sure that we continue to comply with all of the relevant CDC state and local guidelines. Masks, we have to wear them, as our governor says, wear the damn masks. Social distance, you got to stay away. You got to limit the number of employees in the workplace. I think a lot of us are getting used to it right now. I mean, I miss a lot of my coworkers. Sometimes I forget about them because I don't see them, but we'll get through this. But at the same time, you want to keep doing that. And, working from home, we've all discovered it can be done. And I'm a Luddite. I'm not big into this technology, but, I'm getting there. So if I can do it, I think other people can do it. The other thing to keep in mind too, this is the last thing I'll say on it is, we all think that, vaccination is going to be the answer for everything. And it's going to be an important part of the answer here. But, even if you get vaccinated and you have people come back in the workplace, we're still going to have to comply with the CDC guidelines. We're still going to have to wear masks, social distance, limit the number of employees. So by saying we're going to mandate the vaccinations, it doesn't mean it's going to be, back to the old days where everybody hangs around the water cooler, yucking it up and, having big meals in the office and things of that nature. That's not going to happen even with the vaccination. So you want to really be careful about that. And I think I'm almost out of my time, but I would just like to, again, reinforce the notion that was mentioned by all three of our panelists, that this is an evolving situation, that we all have to pay careful attention to all these new developments. Steve mentioned that the vaccines, that the 2 vaccines that have been approved are EUAs, the emergency use authorization. That means that if evidence comes out that they're not very good, the FDA can yank them. So, keep your eyes peeled for that. Hopefully that won't happen. I'm glad to spend some time with you, and you have questions or anything like that, I'm sure you're going to be able to send them on our way, and hopefully we can provide responses. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kevin. We've got a few minutes left, so we'll answer as many questions as we can. The first one is, what happens if an employee or employees refuse to come to work because we are not requiring the vaccination?
Well, I'll take that. And that is really the EEOC guidance of December 16th does not change the landscape on that. If an employer has taken reasonable steps consistent with the CDC requirements and has made the workplace as safe as possible, as safe as professionally recommended by the CDC, and the employee says, well, I don't care, I'm still not coming to work. I think the weight of authority is at that point, the employer has acted reasonably. The person has not stated any disability or any religious situation, simply that I refuse to work in a place where other people have not been vaccinated. The employer is requiring masks, is enforcing social distancing. I think at that point you could terminate employment.
Great, thank you, Steve. If my entire staff gets vaccinated, can we stop all of the other safety measures such as wearing masks, social distancing, and physical barriers?
I can take that one. I think Steve led this conversation today saying we are not doctors, and so I will again reiterate that. However, the CDC I think has already been pretty clear that even with the vaccine, you're still going to have that. I think there's a question as to whether the virus can still be transmitted even if you're not getting sick from it. And so the guidance is at this point that even with the vaccine, you still mask up, you still have social distancing, still wash your hands, still have all of the antibacterial around, and all of those guidelines we're still following. So the answer is no, you can't let go of all those. You still need to follow those requirements.
Thanks, Jen. We've got time for about one more question. Is my company okay making the executive decision to mandate the vaccination?
No, it's not. What we've been trying to impress on everyone for this past hour is that it's a very complicated, nuanced issue. And the company can't simply snap their fingers and say, all right, beginning Tuesday, I'm going to mandate this for a whole panoply of reasons. I mean, one is, right now, and Steve mentioned it, the vaccine, the 2 vaccines that are being used are not given plenary approval by the FDA for general use in the population. It's for EUA, emergency use authorization, which can change depending upon what happens. and they've had EUAs issued that have been revoked. So for the general public, you probably can't do it until there's some pronouncement by the FDA that this vaccine is available for the general public. The other issue we mentioned before is if you're in a situation where a lot of your employees are against it, you're going to have to be thinking carefully about that. Do you want to go to war with your employees over this issue? And third, if you have a union, you can't. You'll be unfair labor practice charges will be filed, and you will be before an NLRB ALJ, and you're going to lose. So for all those reasons, if a company really wants to have vaccinations going forward and they want to make it mandatory, it's something that they should really think long and hard about. Make sure that they have the permission from the FDA to use it, and then work it through with, to make sure that it is the best and that's really needed. Again, if you have a workforce that's not on the front lines, that's not in a high risk environment, the immediacy of having everybody vaccinated probably is not as great.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think that concludes everything that we have for today. Just a quick reminder, a copy of the audio recording and the slide deck will be emailed to everybody within 72 hours of the completion of this presentation. Thank you, Steve, Jen, and Kevin, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccine Employer Considerations. On behalf of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, thank you for joining us today and stay well.